My name is Alex, and let me make something clear. I'm not a fan of horror stories. It's not that they scare me or anything. It's that I just find them absurd. Before I moved to the city with my mom, I had never been one to be easily scared, and rightly so, since I lived in a neighborhood where insecurity was serious and people had real problems. But one October 31st, more than 10 years ago, all that changed. It was Halloween, and after getting a good haul of candy, my friends and I decided to visit a fair that came to town. It was nothing fancy, just a couple of old rides and a Ferris wheel that sounded funny when it spun. But we were 10 and 11-year-olds in a small place, and that was about as exciting as it got. The place sparkled with lights and music everywhere, something we didn't get to enjoy very often. We had been away from the city for a while, and due to our poor economic situation, we didn't get out much. The air smelled of cotton candy and fried food, mixed with laughter and screams of excitement from the children enjoying the rides. Around 9 p.m., we decided to split up. Some wanted to continue trying the rides. Others preferred to go home, and I, on the other hand, I don't know why, but I decided to go for a walk alone. I think I had already had too much time surrounded by people, and that has always overwhelmed me a little. I'm not a fan of crowds. So when I was finally alone, I felt like I had let go of a weight, but I didn't want to admit it. I just knew I needed a moment alone. I walked among the attractions, avoiding the crowds and looking for a quiet spot. That's when I saw something a bit peculiar. It was an old tent, a bit hidden behind other booths. It had no sign, and the entrance was so dark that it seemed to suck the light from the surroundings. For a moment I hesitated to approach, but curiosity got the better of me, and I walked there, feeling a strange connection for that tent. As I got closer, the air felt colder, as if that structure was isolated from the hustle and bustle of the fair. I looked in several directions and saw that there was no one else around, and maybe there was a reason for that, so I decided to go inside. As I crossed the entrance, I realized that the interior was larger than I thought. The atmosphere was heavy and the silence was overwhelming, as if I had entered another world. I knew something wasn't right. I could feel it in every bone, but I couldn't turn back. Something was pulling me towards the center of the tent, where I found a set of stairs leading down. Something very strange. When I went down, I found myself in a long hallway. Something even stranger, because I thought these stairs would take me to a basement. But this was something completely different, almost as if I were in a subway station. With every step I took, the air felt thicker, as if something invisible was trying to hold me back. But I kept moving forward, as if I couldn't slow my feet, as if I was in some kind of trance. But after what seemed like an eternity, I reached a carved wooden door at the end of the hallway, and I could see a dim light shining through the crack. A mixture of curiosity and fear settled in me at that moment, but curiosity won out, so I pushed the door. It opened with a really unsettling creak, but what was inside really took me by surprise. It was a steep, narrow staircase, descending into darkness with the light barely illuminating the steps, leaving everything else plunged into blackness. I felt a churning in my stomach, as if my body knew that those stairs were not the best place to go. But something in my head, something that wasn't right, was pushing me to keep going. I went down the first step, then another, and another, and another. The darkness enveloped me, and the silence was so intense that I could hear my heartbeat racing. That staircase seemed to have no end, and with each step fear invaded me. But there was something that kept calling me, something I could not ignore. Suddenly I snapped back to reality and wondered what the hell I was doing there. Why was I walking down a dark staircase in the middle of nowhere? As I thought that, I noticed that I kept descending without being able to stop. It wasn't that my legs were moving on their own, but there was something in my head telling me I had to keep going. I didn't know how much time had passed, only that with each step, I felt more trapped. It was as if I couldn't see anything, and suddenly I realized that my friends were probably looking for me. I yelled as loud as I could, but no one responded, and still I kept going. I couldn't stop. I tried to make sense of the situation, which helped me clear my mind, albeit little, but suddenly, I stopped dead in my tracks and wondered how I had ended up in a place like this. My instincts were screaming that I should escape, but my legs were heavy, as if I was struggling to move. At that point, I was fighting the urge to keep going down. It was as if an invisible force had me under its control. Still, I made a turn. I was determined to get back up, forcing every movement, but then I heard footsteps behind me. The echo started soft, as if someone was calmly climbing, but then those footsteps became faster and heavier. I couldn't see anything, just total blackness, but I felt something, or someone, coming toward me at full speed. My heart was beating wildly, and I had an unsettling feeling that what was approaching was nothing good, that it was not someone coming to my rescue. To be more exact, it was as if I was sensing the arrival of death itself. And as if that wasn't enough, what happened next was a true horror. First, a drop of blood fell on my face, then another and another and another. I looked up with blurred vision but saw nothing, only felt the hot liquid sliding down my forehead and falling into my mouth. The steps were getting wetter and wetter, soaking with that fresh blood falling from above. My legs, once paralyzed, were now moving at full speed. My survival instinct had taken over at that point, and my body was acting on its own. I started to climb down without thinking. I just wanted to get away from whatever was coming after me. The footsteps sounded closer and closer, and I could feel the ground shaking under my feet, when suddenly, a cold hand landed on my shoulder, with fingers so thin they felt like bones. As I turned around to see who it was, panic made me lose my balance and my feet slipped on the wet steps. It was no ordinary fall. It was as if I was being thrown down the stairs, feeling all my bones creak with each impact. The pain was brutal, but I kept falling and falling as if the staircase would never end. My arms twisted into impossible positions, and although I screamed at the top of my lungs until my throat hurt, no one seemed to hear me. I don't know how long I was falling. I just remember that at some point the pain faded and everything went black. The next thing I knew, I opened my eyes and realized I was outside. The night was gone, and the first rays of sunlight were beginning to peek through. I was lying in a ditch on the side of the road, just outside where the fairground caravans were parked. I felt my bones broken in several places, with dried blood staining my clothes and face. Despite the pain, it seemed that I had managed to escape from that place. I had no idea how I had survived and gotten there. A few moments later, a couple of boys approached me, looked at me and opened their eyes wide when they saw me and started screaming for help. The last thing I remember from that moment was hearing the boys say that he was surely the boy they were looking for. But then everything went dark again, and when I opened my eyes again, I was in the hospital, hooked up to machines, bandaged all over and with both arms and my left leg covered with casts. My parents were there, and my mother looked terrible. Her eyes were swollen shut, and you could tell she had been crying. She hugged me very tightly when she saw that I woke up. My mother asked me what had happened, and I told her the story of what I had been through, but she didn't believe me. I knew because she just stroked my head and told me that everything was going to be okay. Later I found out that the doctors believed that I had been hit by a car and it had fled, but I do not remember anything about any car, nor about walking on the side of the road. What I remember, and very vividly, is what I have just told you. A few days later, still with a splint on my leg and bandages on my arms, I managed to convince my friends to go back to the place where everything happened. I knew they would not believe me, but I still tried to tell them what I had experienced, and I was surprised to notice their interest and that they decided to accompany me to see the place, although only from afar. I wanted to show them that I was not crazy, so I took them to the tent, but when we arrived, there was nothing left. There was only dirt and grass, as if it had never existed. My friends looked at me in disbelief, as if they thought I had lost my mind. But I know what I experienced. I could never prove it, and everyone took it for granted that I was indeed a hit-and-run victim, and that somehow the hit left me with a screw loose and everything else I hallucinated. It was frustrating at first, but then I just let it go and never mentioned the haunted tent again. I began to think that maybe, somehow, I managed to get out of there by sheer luck. Maybe something or someone had decided to let me go like that, as part of a macabre game. What I experienced is something indescribable, something that escapes logic, and the truth is that I escaped only by chance. Sometimes I reflect on what would have happened if I had not managed to get out. Would I have been trapped, tormented by a horrible fate? I don't have all the answers, but one thing is clear. If I had remained on those stairs, my end would surely have been far worse than any death.
Can
Can you imagine feeling a gun pointed at you and hearing the horrifying crack of a bullet going through your bones? Well, that happened to me once on Halloween, but before that event, I was just a kid like any other, who loved candy, trick-or-treating, and dressing up on Halloween. I could say it was my favorite day of the year. You can tell I'm speaking in the past tense, right? I can't even think of anything other than what changed my perception of Halloween forever. I'm 17 now, but I still carry the trauma of that horrifying night, the events of which were chilling enough that I will never forget them for the rest of my life. The first thing I remember were Mike's words. "We're too old for this, don't you think?" He complained in his werewolf costume as I shoved him with a slap on the shoulder. Mike was my best friend and only 12 years old at the time, but the hatred he had for Halloween was unmatched. "Don't be a party pooper. I can't go out trick-or-treating alone," I begged, swinging my bag full of treats. "We only have 12, let's enjoy it while we can. We can't go to Halloween parties like our brothers," I replied as he grimaced. But at the end of the day, I was already in costume and we had nothing better to do either. We hit a few houses and our bag of candy was slowly filling up. The decorations on the houses in the neighborhood looked amazing too. Pumpkins, scary scarecrows, and fake spider webs everywhere. I felt great in my vampire costume, but Mike didn't seem to be equally thrilled. But as we turned the corner, I saw his expression immediately change. "Hey, that's my dad!" he yelled. Sure enough, Mr. Morgan was there, dressed as a pirate, with his hook, eye patch, and toy parrot on his shoulder. "How are you boys, having fun?" he asked us, smiling. "All good, Mr. Morgan," I replied, proudly showing off my bag full of candy. "What are you doing here, Dad?" asked Mike, curious. "I'm helping Jenny. She's too little to walk that far, so I'll get her some candy," he said, holding up a small bag and winking. "Let's go to that house down the street," Mike proposed, pointing to one that had no lights. I stopped dead in my tracks because something about that house immediately gave me a bad feeling. It was dark, undecorated, and the yard looked like a dump with broken bottles and things thrown everywhere. For some reason, a shiver ran down my back, and I felt my heart beating faster than normal. And suddenly, I heard something, like a soft, raspy, deep voice. It was almost like a chilling whisper echoing in my head. I couldn't discern exactly what it said. It was just a weird whisper that made me feel a chill in my veins that I couldn't explain. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mike, with my voice on a thread and that overwhelming sense of dread at the surface. But both Mike and his dad just looked at me in confusion. Then I heard it again, and I was sure it was that same monotone whisper. "Let's go home," I murmured, fear gripping me more and more. "Let's go home," I insisted, feeling a knot in my stomach. "Don't be chicken. You're the one who dragged me here," Mike replied, laughing as he hopped toward the spooky house. Mr. Morgan followed him, and I reluctantly followed them as well, my heart in my throat. They both shouted in unison, "Trick or treat," as they knocked on the door, and the silence that followed was overwhelming. But it didn't last at all, because then, suddenly, bam! The door exploded into 1,000 pieces and a torrent of bullets sent it flying. The wood shattered, and the echo of gunfire echoed throughout the street. I didn't understand what was happening right away. I only know that I fell to the ground, covering my head with my hands, but I wasn't fast enough. A bullet went through my left arm and another hit me in the shoulder. The pain was so intense and sharp that it made me scream. The shooting wouldn't stop. It went on for what seemed like an eternity, until, as suddenly as it started, the shooting died down. Suddenly, a guy staggered out onto the porch holding a smoking gun in his hands. At first, he looked very angry, but then his expression changed drastically to one of horror. "I'm sorry," he began, saying in a whisper. "I thought it was them," he then said with his voice shaking, as his eyes landed near my feet. That's when I came upon a scene that chilled my heart, and to this day haunts my nightmares. Mike lay on the ground, empty-eyed and surrounded by a pool of blood. Bullets had shattered his chest and head, and there was no doubt that he was dead. At that moment, a piercing cry broke the silence that had now formed in the atmosphere. It was Mr. Morgan who rushed to his son's side, crying and screaming in despair. my boy, help, please, somebody help him," he shouted over and over again. The police and paramedics arrived soon after, and I discovered that the gunman was a delusional gang member who was expecting an attack from his rivals and mistook us for them. A stupid mistake that had fatal consequences and landed that guy behind bars, but none of that mattered because Mike was gone. The bullet wounds I had in my body healed over time, but the pain in my heart never went away. Sometimes I wonder if it was all my fault for talking Mike into going out that night, but other times I think about what I thought I saw and heard, and none of it makes sense. Was someone trying to warn me about what was to come? Or was death itself playing a practical joke on me before taking my best friend away from me? I don't know. What I do know is that that was the last time in my entire life that I celebrated Halloween. Ever since that night, whenever October 31st approaches, my heart shrinks and my stomach knots, and memories of that sinister night come rushing back, making me relive that horror over and over again. I hate Halloween, and I think I will forever. Last year was the first time I lived alone in a house, as I had just rented a small place in a new neighborhood closer to my job. I moved in at the beginning of October, and at first it seemed like the neighbors were a bit lonely, so I decided to stay that way too. Everything was pretty normal, actually, or at least it was for the first few weeks. Sometime later, with Halloween in sight, I noticed that only a couple of houses had decorations, and they were no big deal. Just some pumpkins and a couple of signs, but still, that was more than the rest of the houses. I thought about putting a trick-or-treat sign on my door and buying a bag of candy to hand out. When I lived in my old house, I used to buy 3 or 4 large bags, but here I didn't get the impression that people really celebrated Halloween, so I decided that 1 bag would be enough. When the evening came, I got a few small groups of kids, but that was it. I was a little disappointed, as I've always found Halloween to be a lot of fun, even if it was just me handing out treats in my house alone. I didn't want that magic to be broken anyway. It started getting late. It was around 10:30 p.m., so I put the bag of candy away in the pantry and sat down on the couch to watch a scary movie to relax a bit, if you can say that by watching The Hoop. About 45 minutes or so later, I was in the middle of the movie when I heard the doorbell ring. Confused and a little annoyed, I got up and looked through the peephole in the door. I thought for sure it was some kid giving his last round of candy collecting before going home, and I wasn't wrong. There was a little boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, standing in the doorway in a most bizarre costume. Some kind of black cloth with fire-red details and a dark mask that didn't say much. I opened the door and, in a shy voice, he said, "Trick or treat." It was almost 11 o'clock, so I was a little worried for him that he was alone at night. I smiled at him and asked him to wait a minute while I went to get some of the candy I had saved. I went back to the pantry and grabbed a good handful of candy, then went back to the door and dumped it into the little boy's bag. Then I looked behind him looking for his parents or a group of friends, but no one was there. Then the little guy turned around and started to walk away, so I stood in the doorway for a moment, making sure he was okay. But again, I didn't see anyone, so I closed the door and went back to the couch. A couple of minutes passed when the doorbell rang again, and this time I went straight to the pantry, grabbed the bag of candy and went to the door. I opened it and was surprised to see the same boy, but this time he didn't have the bag, or rather the pillowcase he had brought a moment ago. Concerned, I asked him if he was all right, but he didn't answer. Then I looked around again and noticed that there was a man standing at the entrance of the house in front of mine, looking at us. He looked like an adult, but he was also wearing a strange costume, just like the boys. "Is that your dad?" I asked politely, and the boy hesitated for a second to answer, but finally nodded. I asked him why he had come back, and he said he wanted more candy. This confused me even more because he didn't have his pillowcase, but I offered him my bag to take out whatever he wanted. However, the little guy seemed almost annoyed, as if he wasn't satisfied for some reason. In the end, he just reached in as if reluctantly and grabbed only one piece of candy, before running off back to his house. I stood for a couple of seconds in front of the door watching. The whole situation left me a little uneasy, so I locked the door and went back to finish the movie. The movie ended around midnight, then I realized it was pretty late and thought I'd get ready for bed. I got up from the couch and started upstairs to go to my room, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of light outside near one of my windows. I walked over a little nervously and looked, and then realized it was the motion sensor lights near my garage. I stared out the window for a while, getting more and more restless, but nothing happened, so I closed the blinds and went up to my room, but I couldn't sleep a wink. I just lay in bed and lay there, tossing and turning, thinking about how weird everything had been with that guy. But just as I was starting to fall asleep, I heard a soft noise followed by some loud knocking on the door. At that moment, I jumped out of bed and quietly made my way downstairs, nervous and my heart pounding. I made my way to the front door, and just as I was about to look through the peephole, 3 brutal knocks make me jump back. I stood there for a few seconds, my heart racing, hesitating. When I finally looked, it was the man I had seen before, the little boy's father. He was standing there, a couple of inches from the door, in that scary black and red costume and a strange mask. I thought I saw he was holding something in his hand, but it was so close I couldn't make out what it was. At that moment, I knew I couldn't open the door. I had no idea what that guy wanted or who he even was. That's when I ran upstairs, grabbed my phone, and locked myself in the room. I called 911 immediately, even though I felt fear paralyze me. The man kept banging on the door loudly for a couple of minutes before he stopped and went quiet. I stood there waiting for him to leave for what seemed like a century, until I finally looked out my bedroom window facing the sidewalk, and suddenly, I heard a crashing, glass-shattering sound coming from my kitchen. At that moment, terror gripped me from head to toe. I had no weapons in the house, so there was no way to defend myself if I went up to where I was. The only thing I could do was to lock my bedroom door and take the first thing I could find to use as a weapon if necessary. And the only thing I found that could serve for this purpose was the lamp on my bedside table. So I took it, ripped off the cord, and stood next to the door, thinking that if I could hit him in the head and run away. Fortunately, this wasn't necessary, because after a couple of moments I heard police sirens outside, followed by hurried footsteps down the hallway to the kitchen, and then a clanking sound from the other side that told me he would have jumped back out the same window he broke. Still, I didn't leave my room. I waited until the policeman knocked on the door before going downstairs to let them in and tell them what had happened. They checked the whole house to make sure the guy was gone, and that's when they saw the broken window in the kitchen. It was obvious the man had entered through there. After all that, I decided to stay in a hotel for a couple of days to be calmer, although I guess the guy didn't come back this way. I spent the night thinking it all over, wondering if the guy had used his son as some sort of bait to get into my house. I don't know for sure, although he hadn't taken anything. What intrigues me is what he really intended by breaking in like that. It's been almost a year now, and Halloween is just around the corner. I grow increasingly paranoid, fearing that last year's man will return to finish what he had started. I remember that October 31st like it was yesterday. We were in a godforsaken place because my parents wanted to buy a farm. I absolutely disagreed. I had no interest whatsoever in being there. There was just a bunch of empty land, an old barn, and a house that honestly could fall apart at any moment. But what saved me a bit was that I had brought my drone. I thought it might come in handy in case the situation became as dull as I imagined. But of course, with the landscape so dry and drab, I didn't think I could capture anything interesting. While my parents were talking to the salesman at the main house, I decided it was a good time to take the drone out and see if I could find anything worthwhile. So I did, and after a while I zoomed out some more until I came to a cornfield. From up high, the view didn't look so bland, and flying the drone over the corn coils, something on the screen caught my eye. Among the plants, I saw a figure that froze me in my tracks. A mime. He was there, with his face painted white, his eyebrows well marked and his lips red. He was also wearing his unmistakable black tie-dye suit and his black and white striped t-shirt. The costume was very well done, and he was standing there completely still, looking at me through the drone camera. My heart immediately skipped a beat as I realized the situation. I mean, why would there be a mime in the middle of nowhere? These people are usually supposed to be doing street art, but here there was nothing but a very long driveway and nothing but bush for miles around. For a moment, I thought maybe the vendor had a strange sense of humor, or was joking in some way. But as I watched him, something didn't fit the scene. This mime didn't move or gesticulate. He just stood there with his head slightly tilted. That image gave me a discomfort that was hard to explain, as if this was a figure that shouldn't be there, as if something was very wrong, and indeed it was. I couldn't resist my curiosity, so I decided to move the drone a little closer to get a better look. But as soon as I did, the mime turned abruptly and darted off into the woods, bordering the cornfield. I stood in shock for a few seconds, unable to process what I had just seen. Why was it running away like that? It didn't make sense. He wasn't supposed to be there in the first place, let alone running like that. At that instant, I looked at the drone's battery indicator and saw that it was running low. I started to bring it back, but when I looked at the display again, my skin froze. The mime was no longer running toward the forest. He was running after the drone straight toward where I was. At that moment, I was overcome with panic. I couldn't believe it. The mime was coming towards me. It was a crazy situation. I tried to stay calm, although my first impulse was to run away. However, I knew that if I lost control of the drone, it might fall in the middle of the field, and I would have to go out and get it, so with a titanic effort, I just lowered it to the ground close to my feet. I felt time slipping away from me as if every second counted, and I was about to start running away, but I didn't. The mime was closer than I could have imagined. The tension in the air could be cut with a knife, and this strange game of cat and mouse left me cold. What were the man's intentions? Why was he chasing me? As the drone slowly descended, I knew I had to think of a plan fast. I have no idea why I stood still, but the mime was there, right at the edge of the forest, looking at me with those weird eyes. I picked up the drone from the ground, unable to stop thinking about what I had seen. However, I didn't want to give the impression that I was scared, so with feigned calm, I started walking towards the barn. The idea was to pretend nothing had happened, as if my parents were inside and I was just moving along calmly. It didn't make sense, but it was the only thing I could think of. Even though my head was going a mile a minute, I knew that if I ran, the only thing I would do would be to get their attention. I was all alone, and my parents had no idea what was going on. The thought of walking to the main house gave me the creeps, thinking that weird mime would notice I was alone and come after me, so I decided to hide under an old wooden table in the barn. There, although there wasn't much to hide under, I could at least see the entrance without being seen. As I crouched there, I couldn't help but look toward the door, and to my horror, I saw that the mime was following me. The funny thing was, even though he was right there at the entrance, he didn't come in. He just stood there, looking at his cell phone, as if he was waiting for a message or something. For a moment I thought maybe he would leave, but suddenly more mimes appeared. 1, 2, 3. In an instant, 6 mimes were outside the barn, all with these strange looks on their faces, and they weren't saying anything, just giving each other looks and then pointing toward the door. What the hell was this? I didn't understand anything. I felt trapped. What was I going to do? If I ran, they would catch me right away, and if I stayed hidden, they would eventually find me. My head kept spinning, trying to figure out everything that was going on. Why were they there? What did they want from me? But before I could process any further, the mime who was typing on his cell phone decided to come in. The others followed him in line like a poorly made horror movie. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I knew they were looking everywhere. At one point, I realized I couldn't make a sound, and one of the mimes passed incredibly close to my hiding place. Then I could see his feet moving slowly. I breathed as slowly as I could, trying not to make the slightest sound. I had to think of a way out. I had to get out of there. But when the mime leaned towards the table, I thought it was the end of me. So without further thought, I ran away like crazy, turning my back to danger. The mimes instantly realized that I had escaped, and in that second I knew that things were not going to go well for me. I managed to dodge the ones in my path, but in the last few yards, one grabbed one by the shirt and knocked me to the ground. The blow against the dirt of the barn was brutal, but I got up quickly as best I could, because I knew that time was against me. However, that was not enough. Yes, I had managed to escape some of them, but before I could take another step, I was surrounded. I had no idea how many there were or where they came from. All I felt was pain. I couldn't see anything clear with those guys so close, and the adrenaline was keeping me alert, but it was too risky. The last thing I wanted was to end up trapped between them. The situation was getting chaotic, and I knew I had to fight my way out of there before it was too late. I had no way to alert the others either, so I was on my own. I tried to cover myself with my arms, but there were too many of them. Everything happened fast, and it was total chaos. A group of big guys were kicking me on the ground as hard as they could. I was covering my face, but the blows were hitting my stomach, ribs, and between my legs. One of them even tried to kick me in the neck, but I had cowered into a fetal position to avoid getting hurt in that area. I felt a brutal pain in every part of my body. Suddenly, I heard my dad's voice calling me from outside the barn. The mimes stopped for a moment, looking at each other, making those mute miming gestures with their hands. I could barely move, but I knew this was my chance. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was so weak I could barely sit up. But at that, my dad came into the barn, and before I could do anything, those mimes surrounded him too. The scene that followed was worse than I could have imagined. I saw my dad fall to the ground under a hail of blows. He was trying to defend himself, but he had absolutely no chance against those guys. The despair I felt was indescribable. I wanted to help him up, but my body didn't respond. I wanted to scream, but the air didn't leave my lungs. I thought what they were doing to me was horrible, but what they were doing to my father was much worse. They were beating him with a brutality that I could not bear. Suddenly, a scream echoed from outside. It was the owner of the farm with a shotgun in his hand, shouting that he had called the police. As soon as the mimes heard this, they started backing away, trying to escape, but one of them seemed not ready to leave yet. Furious that his fun was running out, he grabbed a huge metal plate he found lying around in the barn and walked toward me. His intention was clear. He wanted to smash my head in with it. He approached me laughing in a way that made my blood run cold, stood in front of me and lifted the metal. He was about to kill me, but at that instant, the owner of the farm pointed the shotgun at him and told him that if he took one more step, he would blow his head off. At that instant, another mime, who seemed to be the sane one, stopped him. "Brad, what the hell do you think you're doing? Do you really think that if you kill one kid, the pigs will leave us alone? Imagine the witch hunt that would be unleashed. We'll all go down because of you." With that warning, the other mimes became furious, and as they gave me another kick, they began to run along with the rest. Soon after, the paramedics and police arrived. They only found and arrested 2 of the 6 guys dressed as mimes, but the one who had tried to kill me was among them. Both my dad and I were taken to the hospital. Fortunately, we were alive, but barely. The mime who had tried to bump me off was convicted of attempted murder. At the time, we were all pretty indignant that the sentence wasn't as high as it should have been, but then I remembered what the other mime had said. If he hadn't stopped it, the guys would have faced much more serious penalties, and I simply wouldn't have been here to tell this story. Adrenaline was still coursing through my veins as I thought about what had happened. Although the horror of that night left us scarred, at least at some point, those responsible were facing the consequences. Life would go on, but nothing would be the same after that. I never really knew what those men dressed as mimes really wanted or who they really were, but at least it gave me some relief to know they were behind bars. I'm an ordinary guy with a wife and 2 little creatures who are my daughters. I lead a pretty normal life with a boring job in a post office, but what I'm about to tell you is something really incredible, so open up a little and listen. I won't judge me if you don't believe me. Honestly, I wouldn't either if it weren't for what my family went through. Here it goes. It all started when we moved into a house that had belonged to my parents. My mother had recently passed away and the house had been vacant for a while. We decided that fulfilling her wish for us to live there would be a good way to fill the place with new memories, along with her granddaughters. What we didn't imagine was that we wouldn't be alone. At first, we only heard strange noises. The girls said they saw shadows walking around the house at night, doors opening and closing by themselves, or the doorbell ringing without anyone ringing it. I can't deny that we heard strange things, but my daughters had never been in a house that big, so I thought it was all a figment of their imagination. Eventually, I began to doubt it myself. I couldn't ignore what was happening. Doors were opening and closing with no wind, and some rooms felt freezing, even in the heat of summer. All of this would be enough to make anyone leave, but there was something that kept me there, even though I wouldn't tell anyone. I believed that the spirit inhabiting the house was my mother's spirit. At first it scared me, but then I began to hear a soft humming of a song that was familiar to me, the same one she used to sing to me when I was a child. My family was not so convinced of what was going on, but I tried to make them see that nothing strange was going on and that everything had an explanation. At first everything was calm, but as time went on, things got weird. Some dishes started flying dangerously close to us. My daughters felt constantly watched, and I had this strange hunch that something bad was coming. I wondered if my mom was getting upset about something or if there was something else going on in the house. The only way to find out was to ask her. We decided to do it on Halloween, the night when spirits are said to be most active. By now, the strange things going on in the house were undisguisable, and I had no choice but to accept in front of my family that there was indeed something strange going on in the house, and I told them what I believed about my mom. It was then that my wife proposed that we try to contact her on Halloween. We bought a Ouija board and everyone seemed to agree. When the night came, my girls went to a friend's house to celebrate and get candy, leaving my wife and I home alone. The house was now just for us, my wife, my brother, who decided to lend us a hand with the whole thing, and me. Actually, my brother wasn't very gullible about the whole thing. He just thought it would be fun to play with the Ouija board on Halloween night. How appropriate, right? I said, half jokingly. Meanwhile, my wife confessed to me that she was scared to death that we would be in the house alone. So before we started thinking about it too much, we started playing with the board. It was an innocent game at first. We asked her simple questions like if there was anyone with us or if she was living in the house. But when we asked if it was my mother, the answer was a resounding no. At that moment, the atmosphere changed drastically. Adam, my brother, went pale as a ghost. "This isn't right, is it? It's not my mother?" he asked in a whisper. "Can we talk to her?" he added. But I was starting to feel like this was getting weird. "I don't know. Maybe we should just drop it," I said, trying to calm the atmosphere. But before I got to finish the sentence, the planchetta began to shake violently, and suddenly, as if someone had thrown it, it was headed my way. Chaos broke out from 1 second to the next. My brother let out a cry of terror. "To hell with this, let's run!" We all rushed for the exit. The house began to shake, and the pictures on the walls just fell off as if the house itself was angry. We made it out and ran for the car, but something made me stop. Behind me, I heard that familiar tune, my mother's humming sound ringing through the air. "Adam, wait, I have to look. Maybe it's there, waiting for me," I yelled back. Truth be told, it sounds crazy, and it probably was. But I wanted to hold on to that small possibility of seeing her one more time. I went back, despite her screams for me to leave. I walked into the room where we had been playing Ouija, and at that moment, the kitchen light began to flicker. I stared, transfixed. And right there in the kitchen was she. When she saw me, she stopped humming and took a step towards me. I was about to go over and hug her, but a strange feeling stopped me. My body felt like it was tied up. I just stood there looking at her. "Thank you, that's all I needed to know," I thought, as reality came crashing down around me. My mother wasn't really there. It had just been a macabre game with the spirits. With tears in my eyes, I ran out to the car where my wife was waiting for me. I turned to look one last time at the house, and there was my mother, smiling and greeting me with that same old smile. But something about her face wasn't right. Her smile looked crooked, as if she were possessed, and her face was vibrating in a frightening way. Several months passed since that horrible night. After my brother took us into his house, we managed to scrape together a couple of pesos and decided to move to a new place. We were thankful that we had not had any more paranormal experiences. We didn't want to sell the house. It was a nightmare that we didn't wish on anyone else. From now on, I just wanted to enjoy time with my wife and daughters. This is what my mother would have really wanted for me. "Oh my God," I blurted out as I watched my daughters laugh and play, feeling that even though she was gone, her love was still alive in my memories. My name is Nathan, and I grew up in a small town in the southern part of the country with my younger sister, whose name was Allie, and my dad. Our mom passed away when we were too young to realize what death meant. From then on, Dad took care of us with all his love and dedication. Allie was always a quiet child, while I was more talkative and outgoing. Because of her reserved nature, she had trouble making friends, so I always took her with me to play with my friends. From a very young age, I realized that I needed to be her support and give her some of the affection she lacked. I remember she would often get dressed in front of the mirror and ask me and Dad how she looked. No matter if she looked funny, we would always respond with a smile, telling her, "You're a beautiful girl." Her cheeks would light up with those compliments, and that filled us all with joy. I went to the same school as her, so all my friends and the neighborhood kids knew Allie. Some would pick on me, teasing her and saying she was weird. That's why she was alone, because no one wanted to be friends with a critter. I remember punching Tani the first time she dared to say that in front of Allie. That night, Allie cried a lot, and for the first time said, "I love Mommy." Our dad had loved our mother more than anything in the world, and her death affected him so much that he never remarried. My aunt tried to set him up with her friend, but he instantly refused. I knew there was another reason behind his refusal. He thought no stepmother could love us the way she did. Dad sacrificed a lot just so that Allie and I could have a happy life. As kids, we participated in all the community events, and the townspeople loved us very much. It was October, and I was excited to go trick-or-treating with my friends. I was 6 years old at the time, and my sister was just 4. She was nervous because it was her first time. We decorated the porch with carved pumpkins, and Dad bought us everything we needed for Halloween. My best friend and I were enjoying lemonade on the porch, watching the neighbors getting ready for Halloween. Kids were running around, and people were laughing as they decorated the neighborhood. Suddenly, I heard Allie chatting with someone. Her bedroom window was right next to where we were sitting, and Dad had gone out to buy some things. So I was the adult in the house at the time and was concerned when I realized Allie was alone. I got up and went to see what was going on. "Who are you talking to?" I asked as I peeked out the window. I saw her sitting on her bed holding her teddy bear and looking toward the closed door. Her gaze changed as I realized I was listening to her. She nodded and said, "Nobody. Why are you standing here?" I smiled and said, "Dad went to the market. Kike and I are on the porch. If you need anything, just call me." She smiled back, and I was relieved. That night, while we were eating dinner, Dad was cooking a nice steak. We were sitting at the dining room table talking about our Halloween costumes when suddenly we heard Allie humming a tune. I hadn't heard it before, and it sounded a little strange, which made me feel like something wasn't quite right. She was on the porch braiding her Barbie doll's hair while humming that strange tune, not even realizing we were sitting there. I looked at my dad and was shocked. His face looked pale as a sheet of paper. Suddenly, he stopped cooking and asked Allie, "Who taught you that melody?" She looked at us puzzled and said, "What tune?" Then Dad insisted, "That one you were humming." But Allie, with her usual innocence, replied that she wasn't singing anything. Her aloof response puzzled me. So I ventured to ask Dad, "What's up with that tune, Dad?" But he, instead of answering, just went back to the kitchen saying it was time to eat. The conversation vanished into thin air as we finished dinner and went to bed. Around midnight, I was awakened by laughter coming from Allie's room. I got up curious because I hadn't heard her laugh like that in a long time. I walked through the darkness to her room to tell her it was time for bed, when, as I opened the door, boom, her lampshade fell to the floor with a dull thud. In that instant, I saw her. The lampshade was floating in the air. Allie's laughter filled the room, and I asked her, "What's that? How can it be in the air?" She, completely disinterested, shrank back on her bed and closed her eyes as if nothing was happening. A shiver ran down my spine at that moment, and I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I told Dad what had happened, and although he tried to remain calm, I could see he was worried, but luckily the excitement of Halloween distracted us a bit from what had happened the night before. Children began to come out into the neighborhood in costume, ready to trick-or-treat. Their voices mingled in the breeze, shouting trick-or-treat, full of joy and fun. For that night, I chose to be Superman and Allie donned a Tinkerbell costume. We were ready to go out and also met up with my friends Kike and Mike as we headed out on a candy hunt. After visiting almost every house on our street, Kike suggested we go exploring a little further out. Of course, Dad had warned me not to stray too far from Allie, but that night, excitement got the best of me and I acted like I was the bravest guy in the world. So we ventured a little farther, with smiles and laughter filling the air as we collected more and more candy in our buckets. Halloween night was filled with magic, and although a part of me was still thinking about what had happened in Allie's room, I decided to enjoy the night to the fullest and forget, at least for a little while, how weird everything had gotten. We were walking along sidewalks that seemed deserted, with the Halloween night enveloping us in its dark cloak. Around us there weren't many houses and the thick forest was starting to get closer and closer. Then I noticed that Allie, who was right next to me, looked pretty scared. She told me that we should turn back, but I replied not to worry, that everything would be fine. However, as we continued walking, her expression of fear did not disappear. After walking for a while, we arrived in front of an old house which seemed completely uninhabited. But the strange thing was that there was a huge pumpkin on the porch, with a lit candle inside, illuminating the place a little. "Let's go explore that house," Kike suggested, and although me and Mike hesitated for a moment, in the end we all started to approach, but when I turned around I noticed that Allie wasn't following us. I saw her standing in the back with a panicked look on her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she insisted that we shouldn't be there, that she had a bad feeling and it was better to go back. I told her to stay near the stairs while we approached the door and started knocking. We knocked several times, but no one answered. Mike, frustrated, kicked the door, and to our surprise, it swung wide open with an unsettling creak. The dark hallway before us smelled musty and old, a scent that wrinkled my nose. "Is anyone home?" I asked, but after a long wait, no one answered. We looked back, but it was at that moment that a soft but deep voice came out of the darkness. "Come in." I was about to step forward when Allie ran up to me and grabbed my hand, frightened. "Don't you see? He wants to hurt you," she said to me as her voice trembled. "Who is it?" I asked, and she slipped in a warning that made all of us tense up. "It's the mommy with the blue face." It was as if a shiver ran down our spines simultaneously. Mike, hearing that, didn't think twice and ran off, followed by Kike without looking back. I stood frozen on the porch, feeling Allie clinging to me very tightly. Suddenly, the woman inside the house spoke again. "Allie, bring him in." Her tone was harsh and angry, as if she was mad at us. Allie yelled, "You're not my mommy," and her voice cracked. When we finally returned home, she burst into tears, and Daddy, seeing her state, looked at me worriedly and said in a shaky voice, "I lied to you. That blue-faced mommy taught me that tune. I don't like her anymore, Daddy. She wants you and Nathan dead." The fear was palpable on Daddy's face. As he stammered, I could see the panic take hold of him. "What does it look like?" Dad asked her. "Is it like his face is blue and he has no eyelids?" She replied. It was terrifying that image would stick in my mind. "I don't want him to visit me in the night anymore," Allie added compunctionately, and I understood, because that sense of dread overwhelmed us all. That night, we decided to all sleep together in Allie's room. However, I remember Dad screaming in the middle of the night, "We need you to leave me and my family alone." It was a spooky experience, and truly that Halloween night was the last time I heard Allie talk about that blue-faced mommy. I don't know if it was all real or if it was just our imagination, and honestly, I don't want to find out. But I'm sure whoever lived in that house had bad intentions and definitely wasn't meant to be a part of our Halloween night.